The opening riff of Jump cut through the forum like electricity made audible. October 24th, 1984. Los Angeles. 20,000 people on their feet, voices joining in a chorus that could be heard 3 blocks away. MTV's cameras captured every angle, broadcasting live to millions of homes across America and beyond. This was Van Halen at their absolute peak, riding the wave of their biggest hit, dominating both radio and television in ways that seemed impossible just months earlier. Eddie Van Halen stood center stage, his iconic red, white, and black striped Frankenstrat guitar slung across his chest. The synthesizer opening of Jump had just finished, and now came the moment everyone was waiting for. The guitar entrance that would launch them into their most explosive song. Eddie's fingers found their position on the fretboard, his right hand poised above the strings. The crowd's roar reached a crescendo of anticipation, but Eddie never played the first chord. His eyes had locked onto something in the front section that made his blood freeze. Third row, directly in his line of sight, sat a young Latina woman who wasn't celebrating. While 20,000 people around her jumped and screamed and pumped their fists, she sat perfectly still, tears streaming down her face. She wore an oversized denim jacket that hung loose on her small frame, and she was crying in a way that Eddie recognized immediately. This wasn't emotion from the music. This was grief. This was pain that cut deeper than anything that could happen on a stage. The synthesizer track continued playing through the sound system, but Eddie's guitar remained silent. David Lee Roth, mid-stride across the stage, turned back toward Eddie with a confused expression. The crowd's cheering began to shift, confusion rippling through the arena as people realized something was wrong. Alex Van Halen kept the drums going, but his eyes were fixed on his brother, trying to understand what was happening. Elena Rodriguez had been sitting in that seat for 3 hours. She had saved every dollar from her job at a record store in East LA for 4 months to buy that ticket. Not for herself. For her 17-year-old brother Miguel, who was lying in a hospital bed 12 miles away at Cedars-Sinai, fighting a battle he couldn't win. Miguel Rodriguez had been diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor 6 months earlier. The doctors had given him 8 months to live. 2 of those months had already passed. The tumor was pressing against areas of his brain that controlled fine motor skills. The thing Miguel loved most in the world, playing guitar, was becoming impossible. His left hand, once capable of complex chord progressions and lightning-fast riffs, now shook uncontrollably. His fingers could no longer find the frets with precision. 3 weeks before the concert, Miguel had looked at his sister with eyes that seemed ancient in his young face and made one desperate request. "Elena, I want to see Eddie Van Halen play live just once before I die. I want to hear that guitar sound, see him do the finger tapping, watch him create magic with his hands. Just once." But Miguel was too sick to leave the hospital. The treatments had destroyed his immune system. His balance was so compromised that he needed assistance just to sit up. The crowds, the noise, the risk of infection, it was all too dangerous. So Elena came alone, wearing Miguel's favorite denim jacket, the one he'd bought with his first paycheck when he was 15, and still believed he had forever to master the guitar. She had been fine through the opening acts, recording what she could on a small handheld tape recorder hidden in her pocket, trying to memorize every detail to share with Miguel later. But when Van Halen took the stage, when she saw Eddie Van Halen in person for the first time, the reality crashed over her like a tidal wave. Miguel would never see this. Miguel would never experience this electric energy, never hear 20,000 people singing along to the songs he'd learned, note by note, never witness his guitar hero doing what he did better than anyone else in the world. All she could do was sit here in his jacket, crying, while her little brother lay in a sterile hospital room, his guitar dreams dying along with his body. Eddie saw all of this in her face. He couldn't know the details yet, but he recognized that kind of pain. He had seen it in his own mirror during the darkest periods of his addiction. He had watched it destroy his first marriage. He had carried it himself as a child immigrant who couldn't speak English, who found his voice only through 6 strings and amplified electricity. The backing track for Jump continued playing, but Eddie slowly removed his guitar strap. The action was so unexpected, so completely wrong for the context, that it created a ripple of confused silence that spread outward from the stage. Dave had stopped singing. Alex's drumming faltered. Michael Anthony stood frozen at his bass. Eddie walked to the front edge of the stage, directly above Elena. He knelt down, bringing himself as close to her eye level as the stage height allowed. When he spoke, his voice was picked up by his wireless microphone, carrying his words to every corner of the arena and into millions of homes. "Hey!" His voice was gentle, carrying traces of his Dutch accent that became more pronounced when he was emotional. "What's wrong?" Elena looked up at Eddie Van Halen, kneeling 3 feet above her, looking directly into her eyes while 20,000 people watched and millions more saw it on television. She felt like her heart might stop. "It's okay," Eddie said softly, his voice somehow filling the massive arena despite its quiet tone. "Take your time. What's your name?" "Elena," she whispered, and somehow the microphone caught it. "Elena. That's a beautiful name." Eddie's voice was patient, unhurried, as if they were alone instead of at the center of a massive live television event. "Tell me why you're crying, Elena. Please." "It's not for me," she said, her voice shaking, but carrying clearly through the sound system. "I'm here for my brother, Miguel. He's 17. He has a brain tumor. He's dying." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for months. "He wanted to come so badly. He plays guitar, or he used to before the tumor made his hands shake too much. He worships you. He's learned every song, every solo. He wanted to see you play live just once, but he's too sick to leave the hospital." Elena's voice broke completely. "I'm wearing his jacket, trying to see this for him, but I can't give him this feeling. I can't save him. I can't give him back his hands. I can't give him back his music." The entire arena fell silent, not the excited silence before a big moment, but the profound quiet of 20,000 people witnessing something sacred. Even the MTV cameras seemed to pause, operators instinctively understanding that they were capturing something more important than a concert. Eddie remained very still for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "What's Miguel's favorite Van Halen song?" Elena wiped her eyes. "Eruption. He practiced it for 2 years before he got it right. He said learning your finger tapping technique was like learning to speak a new language. Now he can't do it anymore. The tumor took that away from him." Eddie stood up slowly. He looked back at his bandmates, at Dave, who was watching with uncharacteristic solemnity, at Alex, who nodded slightly from behind his drum kit. Even in the middle of the biggest live television event of their career, some things mattered more than the show. Eddie turned back to Elena. "Is that a tape recorder in your pocket?" Elena pulled out the small cassette recorder with shaking hands. "I was recording everything for Miguel." "Good, keep it running." Eddie picked up his Frankenstrat again, but instead of returning to his original position, he stayed at the front of the stage, directly in front of Elena. "This is for Miguel Rodriguez, 17 years old, the bravest guitarist I've ever heard of." What followed was something nobody in that arena would ever forget. Eddie played Eruption as a solo acoustic performance. No backing track, no band support, just him and his guitar in front of 20,000 people. But this wasn't the album version or the usual concert arrangement. This was Eddie Van Halen pouring his soul through 6 strings for an audience of one sick teenager watching from a hospital bed. He played it slower than usual, emphasizing the melodic elements over the speed. Every note was deliberate, perfect, filled with emotion that transcended technique. The finger-tapping section, Miguel's favorite part, became a conversation between Eddie and the absent boy. Each tap note seemed to say, "This is how it's done. This is how music heals. This is how we speak when words aren't enough." When the song ended, the silence lasted for nearly 10 seconds before 20,000 people erupted in the loudest applause of the night. But Eddie's attention remained focused on Elena, who was sobbing openly now. "Elena," Eddie said quietly, his words carrying despite the crowd noise. "After the show, I need you to wait backstage. We need to talk about your brother." The rest of the concert was pure magic, but it carried a different energy. Every song, every solo, every moment of showmanship was dedicated to the absent Miguel. Eddie played with a focus and intensity that transcended even his usual standards. This wasn't just a performance anymore. It was a gift. After the show, still sweating and exhausted, Eddie met Elena in a quiet corridor beneath the forum. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand. "Tell me about Miguel," Eddie said, sitting down next to her on a equipment case. "Not about his sickness. Tell me who he is." For 20 minutes, Elena talked about her brother, about how he made her laugh even when the chemotherapy left him too weak to lift his head, about how he'd memorized every Eddie Van Halen interview, every guitar lesson, every piece of trivia, about how he still tried to protect her from worrying too much, even though he was the one dying. When she finished, Eddie pulled out a piece of paper and wrote down a phone number. "This is my guitar tech's number. Call him tomorrow morning. We're going to arrange something for Miguel. Something private, something special. It'll take a few days to organize, but I promise you, your brother is going to have a chance to play music again." 4 days later, a private medical transport arrived at Cedars-Sinai. Miguel was terrified, didn't understand what was happening. Elena held his hand during the entire ride to a small recording studio in Hollywood that had been closed to the public for the afternoon. When the transport doors opened, Eddie Van Halen was standing there waiting, wearing simple jeans and a t-shirt, his famous guitar in a case beside him. "Hello, Miguel," Eddie said, helping to transfer the wheelchair personally. "I heard you wanted to learn some tricks." The studio had been completely prepared. Medical equipment, oxygen tanks, 2 nurses standing by, everything Miguel needed to stay safe. And in the center of the room was a complete guitar setup, amps and effects pedals arranged exactly like Eddie's concert rig. "I can't give you back your left hand," Eddie said, kneeling beside Miguel's wheelchair. "But I can show you something most people don't know. Some of the greatest guitar music ever made was played by people who had to find new ways to make their instruments work." For the next 2 hours, Eddie gave Miguel a private lesson unlike anything that had ever happened in the history of rock music. He showed him alternate tunings that required less finger stretching. He demonstrated slide guitar techniques that could be played with minimal left-hand dexterity. He explained how Django Reinhardt, one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived, had done incredible things with just 2 fingers on his left hand. Most importantly, Eddie set up the guitar and effects in a way that allowed Miguel to create beautiful sounds even with his limited mobility. Together, they recorded a version of Eruption where Miguel played the rhythm parts while Eddie handled the complex lead work. Miguel's face when he heard their collaboration played back was radiant with joy. "Music doesn't die," Eddie said quietly during a break, sitting beside Miguel while Elena wiped away tears from across the room. "Bodies fail, hands shake, voices give out, but music lives forever. What you just played, what we just created together, that's going to outlive all of us." Miguel died 6 weeks later, November 28, 1984. Elena was holding his hand when he passed. In those final weeks, Miguel listened to the recording from that afternoon every single day. He told every nurse, every doctor, every visitor about the day Eddie Van Halen taught him that music was bigger than physical ability. It became his identity in those last weeks. Not the dying kid, but the kid who played Eruption with Eddie Van Halen. Elena received a handwritten letter from Eddie 3 days after Miguel's funeral. "Dear Elena," it read, "I heard about Miguel, and I want you to know something important. Great musicians aren't measured by how fast they can play, but by how much heart they put into every note. Miguel had more musical soul in 17 years than most people develop in a lifetime. He understood what mattered. He never stopped creating, even when his body failed him. That's what makes someone a real musician. You gave him that gift by bringing music into his life. Don't ever forget that you were his first teacher, long before he met me. Take care of yourself. Miguel's music lives on in you. Eddie Van Halen." Elena Rodriguez became a music therapist, specializing in work with terminally ill children. She spent the next 30 years using what Eddie had taught her, that music transcends physical limitations, that creativity can flourish even in the darkest circumstances, that every person deserves to feel the magic of making beautiful sounds. She told Miguel's story to every family she worked with, not to impress them, but to remind them that even in the most hopeless situations, unexpected kindness can appear, that strangers can become angels. That music shows up when we need it most. The footage from that night at the Forum became legendary. People who were there never forgot the moment they realized they were witnessing something more important than entertainment. They were seeing love in action, watching an artist choose human connection over professional obligation. That's who Eddie Van Halen really was. When the cameras stopped rolling and the crowds went home, he saw pain and he responded. He saw a girl crying for her dying brother, and he gave 6 weeks of magic to a boy he'd never met. No publicity, no photographers at the studio session, just one human being recognizing another's suffering and choosing to help. That's greatness, not the technical wizardry or the revolutionary techniques, but the moments when we choose love over convenience, compassion over schedule, connection over performance. Eddie Van Halen stopped playing that night because he understood what mattered most. And in doing so, he gave a dying boy the greatest gift possible: the knowledge that his music mattered, that he mattered, that his short life had touched something eternal.